We live in polarizing times. In many ways, this polarization is fueled by the tribes we are born into, the expectations that society places upon us, and ways we come to identify ourselves. For instance, my name is James, cisgender, heterosexual, biracial male, who socially identifies as black in most instances.
And I'm Courtney. I am a female-identified, cisgendered white person. I was raised East Coast upper class. Now I'm a West Coast high school teacher. And these layers of identity do allow us to see and be seen by one another more clearly.
At the same time, every point of distinction between us creates the potential for misunderstanding.
In many ways, our particular identity markers make us standing up here together in front of you all the more improbable. But James and I have a powerful experience of working together, and we'd like to share some of what we've learned with you about how to collaborate across social difference. Ultimately, we'd like to show you how this collaboration was transformative, especially in moving us towards the kind of equity that benefits everyone. First, we'll tell you how we came to meet each other. It's a story of proximity, even though our origins seem quite distant.
As you will see, Courtney and I come from different points on the spectrum from privilege to marginalization. Growing up, we were asking similar questions about where we belonged, why we mattered, but due to our respective socioeconomic backgrounds, we were getting quite different responses. I was the statistic. By the time I was 12 years old, my family bought our first home in Ferguson, Missouri. We'd already moved 5 times prior. I'd been in 3 different schools, at least once because of desegregation. I acclimated increasingly worse at every juncture. By the time we purchased our home in Ferguson, Missouri, I was the quintessential teenage bundle of insecurity and anxiety. I began acting out at home, in school, and in the neighborhood. My every act of rebellion was met with punishment. Grounded at home, detentions and suspensions at school. And as for the neighborhood, let me just say, Ferguson Police Department did not seem to see a young man struggling to find his way. They saw a young black male and all the threats and fears our society has assigned to that identity. I internalized that identity and acted accordingly. By the time I was 24, I was unemployed, homeless, and when a friend of mine offered to use his connections to get me into Lincoln University, a historically black college in Jefferson City, I rejected the opportunity because it didn't fit my image of who I was. No way I would fit in. I was a thug, a criminal, a hustler. I didn't belong on a college campus. I belonged in the streets.
I grew up in a predominantly white suburb, pretty oblivious to race and class. My parents had organized their lives so I could have the best possible education. By the time I was in high school, I was attending an expensive private boarding school and then Harvard College. But even in those privileged places, I made my fair share of bad choices. I broke some serious school rules, and once, after a college road trip, a speeding ticket I failed to pay in Nevada turned into a warrant for my arrest. But every one of my mistakes was met by the same positive affirmation by the adults around me. They all said, "We know you're better than this," and I believed them.
Earlier, I told you I was the statistic. That's what we call the 1 in 4 young black men who wind up in prison. It was there in California State Prison that the beliefs about who I was began to crack and ultimately splinter. In 2006, I took a class that explored the link between childhood trauma and criminalized behavior. It was that class, and a later class on restorative justice, that taught me that we all have common experiences and that I individually had agency. Restorative justice, they used a profound analogy. Society is like a spider web, and every strand you touch causes all of the others to tremble. It meant that I could never be disconnected from society. Every action I took would affect others either positively or negatively. Growing up, I'd felt increasingly disconnected from society. I now realize I could never be disconnected. My every action would impact others. Just as importantly, theirs would affect me.
So as James was making his way to that restorative justice class, I was moving into a career as a teacher. And that was a pretty comfortable space for me for a long time. And then came 2014. I'd been following the news coverage of police killing young black men. When Michael Brown, an 18-year-old high school graduate, was murdered by a Ferguson police officer, and his body was left bare on the street for over 4 hours, I was horrified. Then came the news that there would be no indictment of the police officer who had killed Michael Brown. And I watched as Ferguson erupted in pain, and I watched as friends of mine, particularly friends of color, were devastated. The majority of my community, however, remained intact, and I didn't feel any less safe on the streets of my city. Because of my race and status, powerful institutions continue to protect me: my job, the police, my elected officials. And yet the same was not true for all of my friends. How was it that we could occupy the same spaces and have such different experiences? Why weren't those institutions protecting them? So I tried to understand the bigger picture. Studying police brutality led me to see the larger injustice in our legal system. And I came to understand how that injustice has led to millions of Americans incarcerated for decades. And then I really had to ask, what was my responsibility in light of this new awareness? I reflected on my resources, and after some internet research, I found a program that offers a free college education to people incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison. That's where I met James.
In 2015, constitutional lawyer Brian Stevenson gave a talk at San Quentin to non-incarcerated teachers and incarcerated students. He spoke of his own experiences of getting proximate to people on death row and the insights he'd gained as a result. Meanwhile, people in the audience reflected on their own relationships to privilege and marginalization.
Sitting in that audience was pretty far from my college experience, and it was also an experience of proximity. On one side of me sat Otter, on the other sat Solo, two diligent students who'd been incarcerated for much of their lives. We were all moved, bound by our shared awe at Brian Stevenson's work and at his call to action. In the years that followed, proximity led to partnership. Solo and I co-wrote a paper, and we presented it together at an academic conference at San Quentin. I collaborated alongside several incarcerated teaching assistants, one of whom stands right here in front of you, on revising a college prep course. And I realized that in each of these collaborations, the quality of our shared efforts was far higher than anything we could have come up with on our own. And yet, I could sense in myself that it was difficult for me to back away in those partnerships from my own power and privilege.
One powerful experience I had with proximity occurred when I took a 12-week-long workshop at San Quentin on criminal justice reform. When I got the syllabus, I was excited to see one guest lecturer would be one of the foremost reform advocates in the state. The day he arrived, my excitement only grew when he said he'd be open to hearing our reform ideas. This was a person who's been consulted by governors and who has successfully passed statewide ballot initiatives that has led to the release of thousands of people. During the class, he spoke about the powerful influence that proximity had upon his own work. He said that cultivating relationships with currently and formerly incarcerated students had given him the credibility needed to make him an influential reformer. Admittedly, his understanding of the beliefs or the benefits of proximity was misguided. He spoke of gaining credibility, not insight. He then proceeded to shoot down every idea we proposed. As the class progressed, it became evident he did not value our experiences. This was a person who successfully helped free thousands of people. I believe, had he been willing to listen to those he was helping, he could have freed tens of thousands. My takeaway was that proximity is indeed vital, but something more is needed. Proximity alone does not address the privilege and the marginalization we bring to every relationship we form in order to affect change. The ways we internalize privilege and marginalization get in the way of true collaboration.
So as you can see, James and I had to make quite a journey to get to a place where we could meet and where we could recognize the value in ourselves and each other and the potential in a collaboration between us.
While I was still incarcerated, Courtney asked me to co-design a high school class called Voices of Incarceration. Though the limitations of proximity were still present for me, one of the things that interested me most was that this class would give me the opportunity to present students with the first-person perspective of the impact mass criminalization is having upon millions of families in this country.
At first, I didn't quite anticipate how powerfully James's involvement would expose my own blind spots. For example, in our very first meeting, James gently noted,
So all of our narratives are coming from incarcerated communities, which is great. What about the survivors of harm? And what if we use the restorative framework?
to be honest, I didn't really know what that meant at all until James explained. He described how we could center the stories of all those caught in the web of incarceration, survivors of harm, district attorneys, family members, even correctional officers. This was just the first of many transformative moments when James's expertise reshaped the course.
Entering into this collaboration, I had questions about Courtney's privilege, but collaborating with Courtney taught me that privilege is relative. As we entered the subject of understanding and reforming the legal system, it was my experiences and the relationships that I'd built that became a strength in our collaboration. At the same time, we relied heavily upon Courtney's pedagogical skills, her knowledge of current media projects on legal reform, and her experience developing curricula.
So through James's contacts and my access to email, we were able to invite an incredible array of guest speakers. And we hoped that these visitors would help our students see the humanity of incarcerated people. We also hoped that they might help reveal how power can seduce other people into losing their humanity. Through intense in-person conversations, we hoped our students would come to understand the problems and the complexities of the legal system.
Courtney had resources. I had extensive experience with the legal system. The question was, could we value both of those assets equally, and would gatekeepers on both sides be willing to sign off on our project?
Lucky for us, they did. But one moment in the class showed us that even transformative collaboration can be plagued by some of the same obstacles as proximity. A few weeks into the course, I brought our students on a field trip to San Quentin. You probably didn't know you can go to prison on a field trip. Our purpose in bringing the students inside was twofold. One, we wanted them to understand the role of correctional officers from a first-person perspective. And two, we wanted them to engage with people who are currently incarcerated, including James.
Before the tour began, we, the tour guides, met the students in the chapel where we introduced ourselves. Before long, the students grew comfortable and asked question after question about our daily routines.
When our students asked what life was like in prison, they were greeted by upbeat descriptions of the self-help programs, of the thousands of outside volunteers who come inside, and of San Quentin as a totally different kind of prison.
This was my first tour, and I was alongside several tour guides who seemed to have been chosen for their appreciation for the benefits of San Quentin. To be fair, rehabilitative aspects of the prison are highly visible. Less visible are the mechanisms of state violence and control that the rehabilitation is immersed in. I mean, students could see the gun tower, but it probably has a different significance when you know you will not be a target. In fact, the gun towers are a strong illustration of how the violence from the state is visible for some, but invisible for others. If I'm being candid, this contradiction produced a moment for me. I was no longer the co-creator of a class critiquing prison. I was now the tour guide on a tour exemplifying the glories of rehabilitative prisons.
A different moment sticks with me. We're looking out over San Quentin's baseball field, and a lieutenant asked one of the incarcerated tour guides to stand very close to one of our students. And the officer says, "So you really think we should give this criminal a baseball bat?" And I look over and I can see the uncertainty in our student's face as he surveys this tattooed, heavily muscled person in front of him. And I can hear the wobble in his voice as he says, "Yeah, give him a baseball bat." There we were, the officer exercising his customary power and inviting us to share in it. At the same time, the officer was reinforcing the narrative of incarcerated people as dangerous and other. There I was again, inside a powerful institution, working hard to protect me, and now to protect our students.
And in that moment, Courtney and I couldn't opt out. We couldn't exchange notes on what we were experiencing. We couldn't engage with the students about what they were noticing. We couldn't even exchange a knowing look for fear of how that might be read by the prison guards. Neither of us recognized ahead of time just how limiting our collaboration could be, even in the midst of this powerful experience of proximity. We realized that transformative collaboration still leaves us susceptible to institutional power. But unlike proximity, where the power dynamics remain static, our partnership meant that we could not only leverage our own power and privilege, but also craft a more comprehensive narrative that would then produce its own leverage.
A few weeks after the tour, we were still shadowed by worries that our students wanted to turn every prison into a version of San Quentin, instead of questioning the root causes of mass criminalization. And then Jason Samuel visited our classroom. Jason had only recently been released from prison, and he shared with us a powerful story of sitting at his own parole hearing and having the police officer he had almost killed show up. But instead of railing against Jason, the police officer named Tom was so moved by Jason's life story that he decided he wanted to help Jason get out of prison. Jason shared their restorative justice process, sitting across from Tom, a man he had shot and almost killed. And Jason described himself weeping as Tom offered him forgiveness. Jason told us what that forgiveness meant to him. Not just freedom and a second chance, but the restoration of his faith in humankind. Jason told us that Tom could forgive me meant that I could forgive everyone who had hurt me. My mom, who was addicted to drugs and lost her kids. My dad, who walked out. Even the guy who cuts me off in traffic or bumps me on the sidewalk. And in that moment, our students shifted. It was no longer about the people in prison who needed rehabilitation. It was about everyone, including them. And it was about forgiveness. Jason's story of restorative justice showed that we're all interconnected, whether we're the cop or the person responsible for harm, or even a student visiting a prison.
We could have never gotten to that moment without the proximity, the trust, and the equity we developed over our journey of collaboration.
So, what is transformative collaboration? Well, it's a process for crafting social change, and it begins by bringing disparate partners together in order to cultivate equity. It does require a willingness to be clear-eyed about the power and privilege you bring to the partnership, and it requires a willingness to leverage that privilege on behalf of the goal, and to relinquish some of your power in the partnership.
And it requires a willingness to see social issues through a dialectical lens.
Here's what we mean by that. I have an argument about how to approach a social problem. It's based on my experience and my social standing in the world and what I see as important and realistic.
I bring the same, recognizing that both of our perspectives are valid and valuable.
Finally, we do have to synthesize those perspectives.
Ultimately, transformative collaboration is restorative. It holds to the principles. It says that though the times are polarizing, we should not be. And it holds to the principles that we are all interconnected, that our communities are stronger when we note the ways we are situated within this stratified social world and intentionally work to mitigate our complicity.
Transformative collaboration requires that we see our differences as strengths. And it requires that we understand that privilege and expertise are not things that some possess and others lack. And it requires that we understand the inherent value in every single person, especially those on the margins.
So, what could transformative collaboration look like for you? And what could it look like in your community? If you're a student that's majoring in engineering, what would it look like to partner with someone who may be impacted by your invention? If you're a recently retired couple, how could you engage with a young family that's struggling to stay afloat? And if you're someone that society has deemed to be on the margins, how have you persisted to understand your own true value?
We recognize that our increasingly nuanced identities have value, even as they sometimes can make us feel farther and farther apart. But if we choose to engage with one another through transformative collaboration, we can not only overcome those differences, we can solve some of the world's problems.
And if we're to build a more equitable society, then we must do it together. Thank you.
Thank you.